Mississippi.
Is there a killer in the house? You would think so after hearing all the reports last week after the government moved to ban asbestos products. What is asbestos? Where do you find it? And what do you do about it when you do find it? Rick Kelly is an industrial hygienist and an expert in asbestos found in the home and the workplace. And welcome to 2 at Noon.
Hi.
First of all, can you explain to us what is asbestos and where is it used in the home?
Be glad to. Asbestos is a naturally occurring rock, essentially. It's a mineral that comes from the Earth's crust. In fact, it belongs to the family of rocks that's the state rock of California, serpentine rock, one of them. It's still mined in California. So it's a natural product that's been used for the last 70 or 80 years in all sorts of construction products, ranging from duct insulation, furnace insulation, lots of things.
If this rock is used and it's going to continue to be mined, what other products is it in other than asbestos?
What other products is asbestos?
Yeah, do they use this rock?
Oh, it's used for road surfacing, for example. There's a lot of roads in the foothills. Okay. Serpentine rock.
Now, is a lot of that rock cancerous, or is it just what they do to that rock when they make asbestos?
It is to largely the intrinsic property of the mineral that makes it a carcinogen. In other words, it makes it cause cancer. So, in fact, there is some concern that some of those road surfacing, which contain asbestos, 5 or 10%, may be a hazard to some extent to the people that live around them.
Obviously not as much danger on the road as it could be in our house.
Clearly.
Where in the house are the places we find asbestos? We have some pictures also we're going to take a look at.
There's a variety of places that you often find asbestos in the house, and then there's other places where you can find it on an occasional basis. For example, a very common place to find it in the house is what we call cottage cheese or acoustic ceilings. Those are the sprayed-on ceilings that look kind of like cottage cheese or popcorns sprayed on the ceiling. 5 to 10% asbestos typically.
Is that still found in houses built today?
They have acoustic ceilings, but they should not, by law, contain asbestos anymore. Okay, in the late 1970s, the manufacture of those particular products with asbestos was banned.
Okay, now often you'll see a duct with tape around it.
Right.
Is that a cause of concern?
Right. In heating systems in general, you find asbestos associated with ducting. Okay, it can be wrapped around the ducting, it can be taped at the seams, it can be on the furnace, it can be in the furnace. You find it associated with hot water pipes, all sorts of things that are involved, heat generating systems that you needed to insulate.
Okay, now if it's around the hot water pipes, what effect will this have maybe on the water itself?
It wouldn't have any effect on the water. The concern with all of these asbestos containing products is eventually they deteriorate. And when they deteriorate, they can release these individual asbestos fibers into the air, okay, by people damaging them, people stirring it up. And when the material's in bad shape and you get asbestos fibers in the air, it's possible to breathe it in. And breathing in asbestos fibers is what you want to avoid because that's the route by which it causes cancer. Just getting it on your skin isn't a hazard. It's breathing in the asbestos. So
when it gets old and we have debris, otherwise if we have a damaged pipe.
Right.
That's the case also.
If you have a pipe leak, you've got to cut through the asbestos to fix the pipe, and that's a problem.
Now, a lot of people wouldn't think this, but a vinyl flooring can contain asbestos.
In fact, it very often does. Linoleum flooring, general name, is often backed by a layer of about 60 to 70% pure asbestos. As it sits on your floor, again, it's not a hazard because it's intact, it's covered by the plastic.
But as it wears out?
Well, more specifically, as you renovate or remodel. So you have a water leak and you've got to tear that up. The very process of tearing up the linoleum is going to cause a significant problem. How
much asbestos does it take for us to breathe in to really be affected by it? Has anybody been able to figure that out?
Well, asbestos has, in very technical jargon, a linear non-threshold dose-response relationship, which means that any exposure carries with it some risk of causing cancer. Now, a very small exposure, which means short and very low level, carries with it a very small risk, whereas obviously a big carries with it a much greater risk.
Now, we talked about earlier a duct with tape wrapped around it. What about a taped ceiling?
In construction of sheetrock walls, it's very common, walls and ceilings.
You find this in a garage, perhaps?
In entire houses, although it's usually painted over inside of a house. You find that the taping material that was used at the joints of the sheetrock contains 1 to 10% asbestos. And again, as long as it stays in the wall, it's not a major concern. But if you decide to change the house, cut a hole in the wall, put in a new window, knock down a wall, you've got a significant problem.
Is there a pre-certain year period where we're going to find the majority of these examples compared to a new house?
Sure. Most asbestos-containing products were banned. Many of the asbestos-containing products that were used in houses typically were banned around the late 1970s. However, that's no fast rule because, for example, linoleum flooring, we mentioned that earlier, may still be made with asbestos and certainly was up until the mid-1980s.
Okay, when we take a break. We take a break. We want to talk about how you go about testing the potential danger in your home for asbestos, how you can go about removing it. Also, if you have any questions for Rick, you can give us a call toll-free right now. Our number here, 1-800-882-6397. We hope to hear from you. We'll be right back.
Meet the average banker. He'd like to convince you his Visa card rates are competitive.
Very competitive.
But no matter how hard he tries, competitive just isn't enough.
Very competitive.
At Valley Credit Union, we're offering our members a Visa card rate of only 13.9%, up to 8 points less than his bank. So call today to find out how your company can join. Valley Credit Union. We compete on a different level.
In 1939, Payless was a small neighborhood pharmacy. Now, 50 years later, we still carry on that first store's commitment to friendly service and lower prices. Your cat will love 9 Lives cat food in assorted flavors, now 4 cans for $1. And your choice of Glad garbage bags in assorted sizes for all your needs, now 2 for $3. We're over 270 stores strong across the western United States. Payless drugstores, 50 years and still growing with you.
Later today on 2 at Noon, part 2 of our series on how America is getting older.
Many bright students end up with average grades. Why? Often they lack the basic study skills. A new study skill workshop has been developed by the California Learning Institute to teach students the basic learning skills essential to academic success. Your junior high or high school student can get better grades, more motivation, and increased self-confidence. The comprehensive 9.5-hour 3-day workshop is a small investment in future. Call the California Learning Institute in Walnut Creek, 1-800-888-0852, extension 987.
Robin Williams and Walter Matthau are the survivors.
You can all go home now. Everything's under control.
Thursday at 8 on Channel 2.
An avalanche. All are feared lost.
I was buried for 5 days inside the smashed building.
2 small children stand frozen in the path of a train.
And I tried to yell and motion for the kids to get away from the track.
We weren't going to stop in time.
Riots and looting in Berkeley. Can ordinary citizens stand up to the mob? Channel 2 reporter Bob McKenzie brings you these dramatic escapes, these courageous moments. Enter the Danger Zone tonight on the 10 o'clock news.
We're back talking with Rick Kelly about removing asbestos from your home, how to test it. You just saw those pictures and you shook your head like that might not be the thing to do.
It wasn't perhaps the best technique for removing the material that I've ever seen. Right?
Can it get very expensive to remove asbestos from the house, almost to the point where it's better to leave well enough alone?
Well, whether or not you retain asbestos or whether you have it removed kind of depends upon a number of factors. One is its condition. If it's intact, if it's not releasing asbestos fibers, it's of obviously a much less hazard than if it's deteriorating, like some of the pictures we saw. On the other hand, if you're going to go ahead and have it removed, it's a very expensive proposition, ranging from a minimum of close to $1,000 to tens of thousands of dollars in extreme cases to have the material removed completely from your house.
So it's something you really have to assess.
It's something that needs to be evaluated very carefully. Also, the process of removal, if it's not done exactly right, can make the situation much worse than before you removed it.
You know what I find fascinating? I find that you can spend thousands of dollars to remove asbestos from your house, and then you can go to the hardware store and spend 30 bucks and bring it right back into your house.
You can spend...
Now, we have a can right here, and this is a perfect example of it.
Right.
Okay.
This is an over-the-counter kind of product, which is a roof patching compound that contains 22% asbestos. And you can go out and buy things like this, as well as gasketing materials and packing materials and vinyl asbestos flooring today.
Does it say asbestos on the
yeah,
can
it sure does in the back. Probably not visible to see.
It's very small print.
Very small print, 22% asbestos.
Asbestos fiber.
And this is not illegal. Okay, it's not particularly hazardous the way it is because it's not very what we call friable. It's bound up with a matrix, but sooner or later that matrix is going to dry out and it's going to become a problem.
Okay, we have a call. I think it's Carmina in Oakland.
Yes, I removed about a 20-foot by 10-foot patch of transite, which is something they use to fireproof houses. It's a tile that's set on top of wood, and my problem is I'm not a contractor, I'm a private individual. Disposing of it is very difficult. I wondered if you had any suggestions. Also, if you had any suggestions to the removal of the rest of it. I want to be able to resell my house, and I also want, while I'm living in this house, to have a safe house for my children and myself.
Was the transite material inside the house or outside?
It's on the outside wall.
Exterior siding, right.
Exterior siding.
Yeah, that's another very common application of asbestos, is the hard sort of tiles that you find on the outside of houses. Not a terribly dangerous material. In fact, probably not regulated as hazardous waste in California, so probably you could get rid of it as regular trash. However, the general advice is not to do that. And as a homeowner, there is an exemption in the state regulations where you can transport up to 50 pounds of that material to an appropriate asbestos waste disposal site without being licensed to do that. You still have to get rid of it.
You really have to take real estate and real estate values into concern.
Right, exactly. The presence of asbestos in both commercial and residential properties has on how easily you can market that property. We've been involved in numerous deals where people have decided not to buy a house because of the presence of damaged asbestos or the presence of lots of asbestos.
Okay, Jack in Fremont, your question for Rick Kelly.
Hi, I had plans to remove a linoleum floor in a bathroom with a water leak. And I was wondering, how could I know I was at risk of breathing in asbestos, and what could I do about it?
Right, good question. If in fact the linoleum is backed with asbestos, the process of removing it is very likely to cause a significant problem. Okay, the first thing to find out is, does it contain asbestos or not? If it doesn't contain asbestos, you have no problem. What's needed to be done there is to take what's called a representative sample and have it analyzed by a procedure called polarized light microscopy, which is it's a standard procedure for analyzing products for asbestos. If it turns out it contains asbestos, then it should be handled by a licensed, qualified asbestos abatement contractor, not by a regular flooring contractor, because they will almost certainly not know how to handle it safely.
Makes you wonder, kind of, is it more dangerous to breathe in a little bit of this stuff or eat 20 apples with Alar?
A lot of things like Alar and a lot of the chemical scare of the week are really based on very little evidence that they cause any human health effects. They killed an animal maybe somewhere in a laboratory. We know for a fact that asbestos has killed literally tens of thousands of people. There's no doubt about that. Tens of thousands of people that work with it. They're heavily exposed to it. And we extrapolate, we assume that it has similar, although less, effects for people that live with it.
Okay, Martha in San Francisco, your question for Rick.
Yes, I live in a house that survived the earthquake, and where they have plasterboard and those slats. Would they have used asbestos material in the early 1900s?
Turn of the century.
Yeah, not real likely, but not impossible. I've been surprised many times by anomalous uses of asbestos. Odds are pretty low, though, for that particular set of circumstances, but it is possible, again.
That's interesting. In what case, and how many cases, will the asbestos, once it's been ripped up or there's debris or the pipes are damaged, will that stay in the air and really cause a great risk of danger?
Well, again, the greatest risk arises when somebody has done some remodeling or renovation work. For example, cutting into a wall which contains asbestos, changing out a furnace which contains asbestos, removing linoleum which contains asbestos. Once you've done something like that without proper controls, you can sometimes have a significant dispersal and it stays around for a fair amount of time.
Okay, let's say we're in a house that was built in the 50s or the 60s, maybe in the early 70s. We know there is asbestos around. How do we start going about getting an evaluation to figure out what we're supposed to do?
Right. A reasonable first step is to have the property inspected by a qualified inspector, industrial hygienist.
How much might that take?
In terms of money, anywhere from $150 to $300, depending upon the number of samples that might be taken to determine how much asbestos is present. Then have the hazard of the asbestos evaluated. Just the presence of asbestos does not imply a hazard. It's the presence of deteriorated or damaged asbestos that's a problem. Once you've identified the problem and laid out the scope of it, you have several choices for trying to mitigate or control the problem. Number one, you can just try to live with it and prevent any further damage, and that's viable sometimes. Alternatively, you can have it removed, which is an expensive and potentially dangerous process itself if not done very carefully. One thing that people bring up a lot is encapsulation, which is essentially sealing the material.
I was just going to ask about that.
It's a good question because people seem to have heard about that quite a bit. It's not something you do yourself, definitely. Again, encapsulation is something that's done by a qualified licensed contractor, okay, that knows how to do this. The problem with encapsulation is that to do it correctly costs maybe 50% as much as to have the asbestos removed, and you still have the asbestos. It's a limited solution.
Not to be so skeptical, a human being, but when you have somebody come in and assess, how often are they going to tell you, well, yes, you should have this stuff removed just so they can make a buck?
Right. That's a problem if the person that does the assessment is a